Eleanor Whitaker did not scream when Walter Briggs grabbed her arm in front of the entire town of Red Hollow. She had learned long ago that screaming only told men like him that he was winning. So she stood perfectly still, her jaw locked, her eyes dry. Her free hand curled into a fist at her side, while 30 people watched from the boardwalk, and not one of them moved. Not one of them breathed her name. She had buried her husband 4 months ago. She had nothing left, and every single person in that town knew it. If this story already has your heart, please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss what happens next. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Red Hollow, Colorado, 1884, and find out what happens when the most dangerous man in the mountains walks through that door. Eleanor had rehearsed what she was going to say. She had stood in front of the cracked mirror above her wash basin that morning and practiced the words until her voice stopped shaking. She was going to walk into Briggs Mercantile, look Walter Briggs in the eye, and tell him that the debt her late husband Thomas had signed was not legally hers to carry. She had read the papers 3 times. She had even written down the exact clause that said so. She had the page folded in her coat pocket. She had been ready. She had not been ready for this. Briggs had not given her a chance to speak. The moment she stepped through the door, he had come around the counter with 2 of his men flanking him, and he had announced to everyone in the store, the women shopping for ribbon, the farmer buying seed corn, the young clerk pretending to organize shelves, that Eleanor Whitaker was a debtor and a woman with no standing, and that she had until sundown to accept his terms or find herself sleeping in the street. "You work for me," he said, his voice carrying the particular kind of ease that belonged to men who had never once been told no. 3 years. You cook, you clean, you do whatever I need done in this establishment. After 3 years, I consider the debt satisfied. Those are generous terms, Mrs. Whitaker. Most men wouldn't offer you anything." "Those aren't terms," Eleanor said. "That's ownership." The room went quiet. Even the women by the ribbon rack stopped moving. Briggs's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. He stepped closer. "Your husband signed that note. That note is real. That debt is real. And you have no husband anymore to stand between you and what's owed." "I have the original contract," Eleanor said, and she pulled the folded page from her pocket. Her hands were not shaking. She was proud of that. Clause 7 states that upon the death of the primary signatory, the outstanding balance transfers to the estate, not the surviving spouse, provided that the surviving spouse holds no co-signed interest. I did not co-sign. Thomas signed alone. I checked. A few people in the store exchanged glances. The young clerk stopped pretending to organize. Briggs looked at the paper in her hand, the way a man looks at something he has already decided doesn't matter. Then he reached out and took her arm. Not the paper. Her arm. "I'm not interested in Clause 7, he said quietly. "I'm interested in what's practical. And practically speaking, Mrs. Whitaker, you have no money, no farm, no family within 300 miles, and no man to help you. What exactly do you think you're going to do?" Eleanor did not pull away. She held his gaze and said slowly and clearly, "Let go of my arm." He did not let go. And then the door opened. Nobody looked at first. Doors opened in general stores all day long. But something changed in the room the moment this particular door opened, the way air changes before a storm, even before you hear thunder. People turned. Briggs's men turned. Even Briggs himself turned his head, though he did not release her arm. The man who walked through the door was not someone Eleanor recognized. He was tall and broad through the shoulders, wearing a heavy coat that smelled of pine and long distances. His beard was the kind that came from not bothering with razors for weeks at a stretch. His boots left dried mud on the floor. He carried a list in one hand, clearly a man who had come in with a purpose, and for a moment he simply stood there, taking in the room with the flat, unhurried gaze of someone who had no interest in being surprised. His eyes moved from Briggs, to the men flanking Briggs, to Eleanor's arm, to Eleanor's face. He did not rush. He didn't need to. He walked to the counter, set his list down on the wood, and spoke to the clerk without looking away from Briggs. "You got everything on that list?" Yes, sir, Mr. Thornton." The clerk stammered. Good, set it aside. Then finally he turned fully toward Briggs. Let her go. Briggs almost laughed. This doesn't concern you, Thornton. This is a business matter between me and this woman. It did concern me. Caleb Thornton said the moment you put your hand on her in public. He hadn't moved from his spot. He didn't reach for the revolver at his hip. He didn't need to. 15 years in the Rockies had stripped away everything unnecessary, including the habit of making threats that required follow-through. Every man in Red Hollow knew it. Every man in that store knew it. Caleb Thornton had not come down from the mountains in 15 years to bluff. I won't say it twice. Briggs released her arm. He let go slowly the way men do when they want you to know they're choosing to comply rather than being forced, but everyone in that room understood what had just happened. The two men flanking Briggs took a small step back. The women by the ribbon rack exhaled. Eleanor stepped away from Briggs. She straightened her coat. She did not thank anyone. She folded her paper and put it back in her pocket. Briggs's voice, when it came, was low and even. You'd better think carefully about what you're doing, Thornton. You ride back up that mountain in a few days, and I'm still going to be here. So is she, Caleb said. He turned back to the counter. Boy, I'll take that list now. That was the moment Eleanor Whitaker looked at the back of Caleb Thornton's shoulders and made the most impulsive decision of her entire life. Wait, she said. He turned slightly, not fully, just enough. Take me with you. The store went so silent she could hear the rope creaking on the porch outside. Caleb looked at her the way a man looks at something he has misheard and is deciding whether to ask for clarification. Behind her, Briggs made a sound that might have been a laugh. Ma'am, Caleb said carefully, you don't know what you're asking. I know exactly what I'm asking. I've read Clause 7 of that contract 3 times, and I know my legal standing, and I also know that by tomorrow morning, Briggs will have found 3 men who will swear that clause doesn't apply, and a judge who will agree with them, because that is how things work in this town, and I have no money left to fight it. She held his gaze. She had practiced keeping her voice steady in front of that mirror. She was using every bit of that practice now. So I'm asking you to take me somewhere he can't reach. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. He looked at her coat thin for the altitude he came from. He looked at her boots, town boots, not trail boots. He looked at the paper sticking slightly out of her pocket, and something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression. There's nothing up there, he said finally. No neighbors, no comfort. The nearest town is a full day's ride, and most of the year the pass is closed. It's cold in ways you haven't been cold, and I am not a man who makes for easy company. Neither am I, Eleanor said. Something moved across Caleb Thornton's face then. It wasn't softness exactly. It was closer to recognition. The way one person looks at another and sees against all expectation something familiar. He picked up his list from the counter. Add a second set of supplies, he told the clerk. Trail boots, women's size boy, look at her feet and make your best guess. Wool coat, 2 wool blankets. He didn't look at Eleanor when he said, Be outside in an hour. We ride before the light changes. Briggs took a step forward. Thornton, she owes me a legal debt. How much? Caleb said flatly. Briggs blinked. What? The debt. How much? A pause. Briggs named a figure. Caleb reached into his coat and counted out bills from the money he had made trading furs all winter. Money he had carried down the mountain to buy flour and salt and ammunition, and he set it on the counter without ceremony. The way a man pays for something he considers settled and does not intend to discuss further. There's your debt, he said. Come after her again, and you'll be explaining yourself to more than a circuit judge. He picked up his supplies. He walked toward the door. He paused with his hand on the frame and said without turning around, 1 hour, ma'am. Then he was gone. Eleanor stood in the middle of Briggs Mercantile in Red Hollow, Colorado, in the summer of 1884, holding a legal clause that had almost saved her, and staring at a door that had just offered her something she could not name yet. Behind her, Briggs was very still. Around her, 30 people who had not moved when she needed them were watching her now with the complicated expressions of people who understood they had just witnessed something they would be talking about for years. She turned, walked to the door, and did not look back. She had 1 hour. She had almost nothing to pack. She didn't know the man's first name yet, or where exactly his cabin sat in those mountains, or whether she was walking toward safety or toward a different kind of danger. She didn't know whether he was kind or merely principled, whether silence meant peace or threat, whether the cold he'd described was the honest kind or the kind men use to frighten women out of good decisions. What she knew was this: Walter Briggs's hand had been on her arm, and the whole town had watched, and not one person had moved until a stranger with mud on his boots and 15 years of mountain winter in his eyes had said 3 words and changed the temperature of the room. She figured a man like that was worth 1 hour of her time to find out. She was wrong about one thing, though. It wasn't going to take an hour. It was going to take the rest of her life. Eleanor had exactly 43 minutes. She knew because she counted them walking back to the boarding house where she had been renting a single room since the bank took the farm. Her boots hitting the wooden boards of the sidewalk in a rhythm that felt like the only solid thing left in her life. 43 minutes to decide whether she was a woman who got on a horse with a stranger and rode into the Rockies, or a woman who stayed in Red Hollow and waited for Walter Briggs to find another angle. She already knew the answer. She had known it the moment she walked out of that store. The room she'd been renting held almost nothing. A trunk with 2 dresses, a wool shawl her mother had made the Bible Thomas had carried since he was 12 years old, a small tin box with the letters she'd saved, and the leather folder that held every document connected to the farm, the debt, and the clause she'd memorized like a prayer. She packed all of it in under 10 minutes. Then she sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the window and thought about Thomas. Not the way she usually thought about him, with the dull ache of a wound that had stopped bleeding but hadn't healed. She thought about the specific conversation they'd had the winter before he died, when the farm was struggling, and he'd said quietly more to himself than to her. "Eleanor, I think I made a mistake." He had meant the loan. He had meant Briggs. But she had thought at the time that he meant something larger. She still wasn't sure. She picked up the trunk, carried it down the stairs herself, and walked back out into the street. Caleb Thornton was already waiting. He stood beside 2 horses, his own, and a rented bay mare he'd arranged at the livery without being asked. The supplies were loaded and balanced with the efficiency of a man who had been packing trails for the better part of 2 decades. He looked at her trunk, looked at her, and without a word took it from her hands and secured it behind the mare's saddle with 3 quick movements. "You ride?" he asked. "Well enough." He nodded once. He held the mare's bridle while she mounted. He did not offer his hand to help her up. She understood instinctively that this was not rudeness, but something else, a kind of respect for her ability to manage herself. She was right, though she didn't know it yet. They rode out of Red Hollow without ceremony. No one came out to say goodbye. A few people watched from doorways. Briggs himself stood on the porch of the mercantile with his thumbs in his vest pockets, and Eleanor felt his gaze on her back all the way down the main street and around the bend where the town disappeared behind the tree line, and she didn't look back once. For the first hour, neither of them spoke. This was not uncomfortable exactly. It was the silence of 2 people who both understood that words spent poorly were words wasted, and neither of them had anything to say. Yet that wasn't going to sound either foolish or presumptuous. The trail climbed steadily. The air changed, cooled, thinned slightly. Eleanor's town coat was not warm enough, and she knew it, but she said nothing. Caleb noticed. He pulled something from his pack without stopping the horses, a heavy wool overshirt, and held it out to her sideways without comment. She took it. She put it on. She did not thank him effusively. "Thank you," she said. He said. That was the first exchange. The second came an hour later, when the trail narrowed and the mare stumbled slightly on loose shale, and Eleanor corrected her with calm hands and quiet legs. No panic, no yanking at the reins, just a steady adjustment that told Caleb everything he needed to know about whether she'd been lying about her riding. "You said well enough," he said. "I didn't want to brag," she said. He made a sound that might in another man have been the beginning of a laugh. In Caleb Thornton, it was simply an exhale that lasted a half-second longer than usual. But Eleanor noted it. They stopped once before dark to water the horses at a creek crossing. Eleanor dismounted before he could offer any assistance, watered the mare herself, and then stood at the creek's edge, drinking from her cupped hands while Caleb filled his canteen upstream. She watched him sideways. He moved the way very few people moved, with a complete absence of wasted motion, each action going directly from intention to execution, without the hesitation that most people carried in their bodies without realizing it. "How long have you been up here?" she asked. 15 years, give or take." Alone the whole time. A pause. Long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. "Mostly." She let it go. She had learned from Thomas that when a man said mostly in that particular tone, the exception to mostly was the thing that explained everything else about him, and it was not information you pressed for on the first day. They made camp before full dark, high enough that the air had real teeth in it. Caleb built a fire with the speed of long practice. Eleanor set up the cooking supplies without being asked, and made a meal from what they had: dried beans, salt pork, coffee strong enough to strip paint, and cornbread baked in the iron skillet she'd noticed in the pack and recognized immediately as the tool of someone who cooked for himself regularly and took it seriously. Caleb ate without comment, which she would come to understand was the highest compliment he gave to cooking. He ate everything. He poured a second cup of coffee. He looked at the fire. "You're not what I expected," he said finally. "What did you expect?" "Crying by now. Asking me to turn back. Telling me you made a mistake." Eleanor wrapped both hands around her cup. "The night is young," she said. This time, the exhale lasted a full second. Definite laugh territory, even if it never fully arrived. "That clause you quoted," he said. "Clause 7. You really read the whole contract." 3 times. Thomas signed everything himself. He was protecting me, I think. He just didn't tell me he'd done it, which is the kind of thing that would have made me furious with him if he were alive to be furious at. She paused. "He's been gone 4 months." "I know. Word travels even up here." She looked at him. "Then you knew who I was before you walked into that store." "I knew your name. I knew your husband had died and Briggs was making a move on the widow's property. That's the kind of news that reaches the trading post." He set down his cup. "I didn't go in there planning to intervene. I went in for flour. And yet." "And yet," he agreed. The fire snapped. Somewhere in the dark above them, something moved through the brush. Something large enough that Eleanor registered it, but steady enough in its movement that she understood it was not a threat. Caleb didn't even glance toward the sound. He was reading it the way she read legal text, quickly, thoroughly, and without drama. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You can ask. Why did you pay the debt? You could have just stopped him from touching me and gone back to your supplies. That would have been enough for the moment. Instead, you spent what looked like most of what you came down here to earn." Caleb was quiet for a moment. He turned his cup in his hands, a slow rotation, and Eleanor had the sense he was not choosing what to say so much as deciding whether to say it. "Because stopping a man in the moment doesn't stop him," he said. "I've lived long enough to know that. I stop Briggs today, you walk out of that store free and clear, and by tomorrow morning he's got 3 men who'll swear the clause doesn't apply, and a friendly judge, and you're right back where you started. So I stopped him in a way that took the ground out from under him." He looked up from the fire. "Besides, I had the money. Didn't need it bad enough to watch a woman lose everything for want of it." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. "That's the most words you've said in a row since we met." "Don't get used to it," he said. She smiled. It was the first genuine smile she'd felt on her face in 4 months. It surprised her the way a warm current in cold water surprises you suddenly and completely. They slept on opposite sides of the fire with the propriety of 2 people who understood exactly what was at stake and had both decided without discussing it to behave accordingly. Eleanor slept better than she had since Thomas died. She didn't know what to make of that. The second day was harder. The trail steepened significantly, and by mid-morning they were in territory. Eleanor had never seen in her life, not in topography, but in atmosphere. The air was thin and cold, and tasted like something sharp. The trees were different up here, shorter, harder shaped by years of wind, into postures that suggested stubbornness rather than growth. Eleanor's thighs ached from the grade. Her lungs worked harder than they were accustomed to. She said nothing. Caleb said without looking at her, "Breathe slower. Your body wants to breathe fast up here. Don't let it." She tried it. It helped. She noted that he had said it exactly when she needed to hear it, and not one moment before, which told her he had been watching her without appearing to. "You've brought other people up here before?" she said. Not a question. "Hunters, traders. Once a marshal chasing someone I'd seen passing through." He paused. "Never a woman." "Should I feel special?" "You should feel cold," he said. "We've got another 4 hours." The 4 hours were not gentle. By the time Caleb's cabin came into sight, through the trees, Eleanor's hands were numb despite the wool coat, and her back had developed a specific complaint in the region just above her left hip that she intended to address firmly as soon as she was off the horse. She looked at the cabin. It was smaller than she'd imagined. Solid, though. The logs fitted closely. The roof was sound. The stone chimney showed signs of regular use. Someone lived here who intended to keep living here. She dismounted. Her legs almost didn't catch her. She caught herself on the mare's saddle, waited 2 seconds for the feeling to return, and then stepped away as if nothing had happened. Caleb had seen it. Of course he had. He said nothing. He began unloading supplies. "Tell me what to do," Eleanor said. He looked at her. "You just rode 4 hours up a mountain in clothes that weren't made for it. You can rest." "I rested all winter," she said. "Tell me what to do." Something moved behind his eyes. Not admiration exactly, something quieter. He handed her a bundle of supplies. "Dry goods go in the cabinet on the left. Bottom shelf is for things that need to stay cold. Don't put the coffee on the bottom shelf. I made that mistake in winter of '79, and I'm not over it." She laughed. A real one, sudden and unguarded. He blinked as though the sound startled him, though he covered it immediately. "What's funny?" he said. "Nothing, the coffee. Tell me about the coffee." "There's nothing to tell. I put it on the bottom shelf in winter of '79, and it froze solid, and I had to chip it out with a knife, and it tasted like bark for 6 weeks. She was still smiling when she carried the supplies inside. The cabin was one large room with a loft sleeping area above it. There was a fireplace, a table, 2 chairs, a shelf of books that surprised her enormously, a collection of tools hanging with military precision on the far wall, and a narrow bed against the east side. Clean, though. The kind of clean that came from someone who lived alone, and had decided long ago that disorder cost too much in a small space. She stood in the middle of the room and made a series of rapid calculations she did not voice. 1 bed, 1 room. A man who had clearly lived alone for 15 years and had the habits to prove it. And herself, a widow of 4 months, who had ridden up a mountain with a stranger and was now standing in his home, trying to figure out what exactly the arrangement was. Caleb came in behind her. He read the situation immediately. "There's a cot in the storage room," he said. "I'll sleep there." "That's your bed. I'll take the cot." "You'll freeze on the cot. The storage room doesn't hold heat." "Then I'll take blankets." "Mrs. Whitaker." "Eleanor." He stopped. "Eleanor, you take the bed. I've slept in worse places than a storage room, and I've slept in them by choice. This is not a negotiation I intend to have more than once." She recognized the tone. Final, not harsh. The tone of a man who made a decision and meant it. "All right," she said. "But I cook. That's not a negotiation either." He looked at her for a moment. "You're going to be difficult," he said. "Probably," she agreed. He nodded once and turned to build the fire. What followed were the strangest 2 weeks of Eleanor Whitaker's life, and she had lived through some genuinely strange weeks. The first 3 days were an education in how completely unprepared she was for the altitude, and she did not much enjoy being educated on this point, because it meant she moved slower than she wanted to, tired faster than she should have, and had to ask Caleb twice to wait for her on the trail when they went to check his trap lines in the morning. Each time he waited without comment, without impatience, simply stopped and stood and watched the trees and waited until she caught up, and then started walking again at a pace that was almost but not quite slower than his natural one. She noticed. On the 4th day, she kept up without asking him to wait. On the 5th day, she was walking ahead of him on the trail when she found the tracks in the mud near the eastern creek line, a set of boot prints she didn't recognize as belonging to any animal. She stopped. Caleb. He was there in a moment beside her looking down. His expression didn't change, but she felt the shift in his attention, the sharpening of it, the way a hunting dog goes still before the point. Human, she said. Yes. Recent, this morning. He crouched, examined the print, stood again. Someone came up from the south trail, came close to the cabin line and turned back. He paused. That's not a hunter's path. Eleanor felt something cold that had nothing to do with the altitude. Briggs, she said. Or someone Briggs sent. He looked at her. You're not surprised. I told you he'd find another angle. She pulled her coat tighter. What do? We go back to the cabin, he said, and we have a conversation I was hoping to avoid for another week. They walked back in silence, the comfortable kind of silence they had already developed, the kind that carried information in it, rather than absence. When they got back to the cabin, Caleb opened the trunk she had packed and brought from Red Hollow. She would have objected, but she realized immediately he wasn't looking through her things. He was looking at the leather folder on top. The documents, he said. All of them. Everything connected to the farm, the loan, the property lines. He set the folder on the table. He pulled out the papers, all of them, and spread them without ceremony. Then he looked at them for a long time. Eleanor watched him reading. He read the way he did everything else, with complete attention and no performance of effort. Your husband's signature is the only one on the note, he said. Yes, but this property deed, he pointed. This has your name on it. Thomas added my name to the deed when we married. He said it was right. Briggs knows this. Eleanor went still. I'm not sure. Caleb turned to look at her fully. Because if your name is on the deed, Eleanor and Thomas signed the loan against the property, then there's an argument to be made that he needed your signature on the loan to make it binding. And he didn't get it, which means Clause 7 might not even be the most important clause, Eleanor said slowly. Which means the whole loan might be challengeable, Caleb said. They stared at each other across the table, covered in papers. The fire going behind them, the tracks outside already being rained on by the clouds that had moved in from the west, and Eleanor felt something shift in her chest. Not hope exactly. Something sharper. The thing you feel when you realize the game you've been playing had different rules than you knew, and the new rules might be in your favor. He doesn't know I have all of these, she said. I took everything from the house when I left. He would have assumed I only had the note. Then whoever he sent up here wasn't just checking on you, Caleb said. They were looking for papers. The cabin felt smaller suddenly, and the mountains outside, which had felt like protection for 2 weeks, felt for the first time like something that could also be a trap. Eleanor reached across the table and gathered the papers. She put them back in the leather folder with careful hands and looked at Caleb Thornton across that table. This man she had known for 2 weeks. This man who had given her his bed, and his coffee story, and his particular silences, and she said, I need to know something. Ask it. When this is over, however it ends, what were you planning to do with me? He was quiet for a moment. I hadn't thought that far. I think you should start. He looked at her. The fire behind her put light in her hair, and she was aware of it in the way you are aware of something you can't control. He looked for a long time in that way he had that wasn't staring, but was something more serious than looking. I was going to figure out how to get you safely back to somewhere Briggs couldn't reach you, he said. Get you set up somewhere with money enough to fight him legally with those papers. And you, I was going to come back up here. Alone. It's what I do, he said. And there was something in it, not bitterness, not self-pity, just the flat statement of a man who has accepted the terms of his own life so completely that he no longer noticed them as unusual. Eleanor put the folder under her arm. That was a very generous plan, she said, very selfless. It seemed practical. It seems lonely, she said. And she said it without cruelty, the same way he said most things, as a simple truth that didn't require decoration. Then she walked to the shelf where she kept her supplies and began making supper, and Caleb sat down at the table and was very quiet for a very long time. That night, after they'd eaten and the fire had burned down to coals and Eleanor had said goodnight and climbed to the loft with the folder tucked under the mattress, and Caleb had gone to the storage room with his blankets, she lay on her back in the dark and thought about the way he'd said, "It's what I do." Not, "It's what I want." Not, "It's what I choose." It's what I do. She thought about that for a long time. In the morning, she decided to teach herself to shoot. She didn't announce this. She simply went to the wall where Caleb's extra rifle hung, and when he came in from his morning check and found her examining it with the careful attention she gave to legal documents, he stopped in the doorway. "You know how to handle a rifle," he said. "I know which end the bullet comes out of. That's a start. Teach me the rest." He looked at her for a moment. Then he walked to her and took the rifle from her hands and checked it with automatic movements. "All right," he said. "We'll go out after breakfast, but Eleanor—" She looked up. "Whoever Briggs sent up that trail yesterday is going to come back," he said. "And when they do, they're not going to come to talk." "I know," she said. "I need you to understand that. Not in the way you understand legal clauses. In the way you understand that this is real and it is coming." She met his eyes directly the way she had in the Mercantile when she'd quoted Clause 7 at a man twice her size. "Caleb," she said, "I've been understanding real things my whole life. I just haven't had anyone willing to stand next to me while I dealt with them." He held her gaze. The storage room door was still open behind him. The morning was sharp and cold, and somewhere outside a hawk was doing something urgent and efficient in the trees. "Breakfast first," he said finally. "Breakfast first," she agreed. She turned to the stove, and behind her she heard him let out one slow breath, and she understood without turning around that something had just changed between them. Not dramatically. Not the way it happened in the stories women told each other at quilting bees, with declarations and grand gestures. It changed the way weather changed at altitude, quickly and completely, and with the sense that there was no going back to what it had been before. She made the coffee strong the way she'd learned he liked it, and put it on the right shelf, and did not say anything about it. And when he sat down across from her and poured his cup, and the morning came through the small window and fell across the table between them, she thought about Thomas again briefly. She thought about how Thomas had said he thought he'd made a mistake. And she thought that maybe the mistake wasn't just the loan. Maybe the mistake was something else entirely. Maybe it was never telling her what he was carrying, never letting her stand next to him while he dealt with real things. She pushed the thought down. It was too early in the day for that kind of grief, and she had a rifle lesson to get through. But it stayed with her, the way true things do. The rifle lesson did not go the way Eleanor expected, which was to say it went considerably better. She had expected Caleb to be the kind of teacher who corrected constantly, who took the gun from her hands to demonstrate who explained things in the patient and slightly condescending tone that men used when they taught women things they assumed women couldn't learn. Thomas had taught her to ride that way. Her father had taught her to fish that way. She had learned to absorb the condescension, along with the instruction, and simply extract what was useful. Caleb stood behind her and to the left, not touching, and said, "Show me what you already know." She raised the rifle. She sighted along the barrel the way she had seen Thomas do it, settling her cheek against the stock, trying to remember what she'd observed over years of watching without being invited to participate. "Your left elbow," Caleb said. "What about it?" "It's doing the work your shoulder should be doing. When it fires, that elbow's going to tell you about it." She adjusted. She could feel immediately that he was right the way you can feel when a chair is balanced wrong before it tips. She resettled, sighted again. "Better," he said. Just that. No elaboration, no praise beyond the single word. She was beginning to understand that with Caleb, better was significant. The first shot hit the pine he'd indicated about 2 feet below where she'd aimed. The second was closer. By the sixth, she was consistent enough that he nodded once and said, "All right, that's a foundation." He reloaded for her without ceremony. "Now do it again, but this time, something is coming toward you, and you don't have the time to think about your elbow." "How do I stop thinking about my elbow?" "You practice until you don't have to think about it, same as anything." She fired again. Better. The recoil was something she was already adjusting for compensating in the split second before the next shot, the way her body compensated on the horse, instinctively, mechanically. She had good instincts. She had always had good instincts. She had simply never been given the tools to act on them. "You're a fast learner," Caleb said. "I've had a lot of practice learning fast," she said. "Circumstances." They practiced for 2 hours. By the end of it, her shoulder was complaining in a specific and pointed way, and her hands were cold despite her gloves, and she was the most satisfied she had felt since Thomas died. Not happy exactly. Satisfied. The feeling of a skill taking root. Walking back to the cabin, she said, "Tell me about your wife." He didn't break stride. Didn't slow down. But she felt him register the question in the way she'd become attuned to a barely perceptible shift in the quality of his silence. "What makes you think I had one?" he said. "The books," she said. "Half of them are women's novels, the kind a man doesn't buy for himself." A long pause. "Her name was Margaret," he said. "My daughter was Clara. She was 4. Eleanor didn't say she was sorry. She had said she was sorry about Thomas to too many people who wanted her to say it and had found that it was one of the emptiest phrases in the English language. Instead, she said, "How long ago?" 15 years. Winter of '69. Fever came through. I was out on the trap lines for 3 days, and when I came back..." He stopped, started again. "When I came back, they were both gone. And you came up here." "I was already up here. I just stopped coming down." Eleanor walked beside him in silence for a moment, thinking about that. A man who had already chosen the mountain and then had the mountain confirmed as the right choice by grief. A man who had not fled to isolation, but had simply stayed in it because the alternative, the town, the people, the ordinary warmth of human life, was the place where he had lost everything. "The books," she said. "You kept them. They were hers. You read them." Another pause. "Some of them, after a while." She did not say anything more about it. She understood what it meant to read a dead person's books. She had read all of Thomas's letters to her twice over since he died, even the early ones from before they were married when he was still formal and nervous in his writing. She understood perfectly. That night, something woke her. Not a sound from inside the cabin. Something from outside a particular quality of stillness that was the opposite of the ordinary night stillness she had grown accustomed to in 3 weeks at altitude. This was a stillness that had something in it. She lay without moving and listened to it with her whole body, the way Caleb had taught her to listen to the trail. Then she heard it. A soft impact. A boot heel on frozen ground, careful and deliberate. She was out of the loft in seconds. She did not light a lamp. She crossed the dark cabin to Caleb's storage room door and knocked twice quickly, and by the time she had taken 2 steps back, he was already through the door, fully awake, rifle in hand, because Caleb Thornton apparently slept the way he did. Everything else with one part of his attention always on the perimeter. "North side," she said quietly. 1, maybe 2. Trying to be quiet. He looked at her for half a second in the dark, assessing not whether she was right, but how right she was. He moved to the window without lighting anything. She moved to the other side of the door, and when he glanced at her, she already had the rifle she'd been practicing with in her hands, and she saw him make a decision in the half-second he spent not telling her to put it down. 2, he said quietly, looking through the edge of the window. "Coming from the tree line. They've got the angle on the door." Back window. Not yet. But if they split up, I'll watch it, she said. He looked at her again. Eleanor, I've had 3 weeks of practice and I'll keep my elbow right, she said. What do they want? The papers, or you, or to make a point to me about what happens when I interfere with Briggs's business. He checked his rifle. Maybe all 3. How many bullets between us? Enough. He moved toward the door. Stay on that window, if anyone comes through it. I know what to do, she said. He believed her. She could tell by the fact that he nodded and turned away instead of repeating himself. What happened next took about 4 minutes and felt like 40. The 2 men at the front did not knock. They didn't announce themselves. The first indication of their real intention was when something heavy struck the door. Not a fist, something with more commitment, a boot heel or a ram of some kind. And Caleb was braced behind the table he'd pulled across the room in the dark in the 20 seconds before impact. The door held. The bolt Caleb had installed was iron, and the frame was solid log, and whoever was outside had underestimated both. The second impact shook the walls. Eleanor kept her eyes on the back window. She was breathing the way Caleb had told her to breathe at altitude, slow, deliberate, not letting her body panic her into speed. Her hands were steady. She was aware of this with a small, clear part of her mind that observed her own functioning, the way she observed legal text factually and without sentiment. The third impact didn't come. What came instead was a voice from outside, unfamiliar, rough. The voice of a man who was being paid for a task and had already gotten frustrated with how the task was going. Thornton, we're not here for you. Send the woman out with the papers and we ride away. Caleb said nothing. Thornton, we know she's in there. Briggs wants the documents and the woman. You give us both and this ends right now. Silence from Caleb. Eleanor said quietly from her position at the window. There's a third one. Where? Coming around the east side. He thinks I can't see him because there's no lamp. A pause. Then from Caleb, very quiet. Can you? Yes. Can you make the shot if you need to? Her hands did not shake. I need him to come 6 feet closer. He will, Caleb said. People who think they're not seen always do. He was right. The third man came 4 more steps out of the tree line, settling into what he clearly believed was a good position, and Eleanor had one clear moment, and she took it. She did not aim at the man. She aimed at the iron post of the fence line 2 feet to his right, a target she could see clearly, and that would make a sound and a spark that told him in no uncertain terms that someone inside could see him perfectly and had chosen this time to miss. The shot rang out. The spark flew. The man dropped flat and scrambled backward, and from outside she heard one of the front men say, "What?" and the other say, "She's armed." And Caleb said loudly and clearly from inside the cabin, "Next one won't be a warning. I've got enough ammunition to make this inconvenient for all 3 of you, and the woman inside has demonstrated she doesn't need my help. Ride back to Briggs and tell him Clause 7 isn't the only problem he has." A long silence from outside. The kind of silence that meant men were communicating with each other in looks and gestures and making calculations about pay versus risk. "Briggs isn't going to be happy," the voice from outside said. "Briggs isn't here," Caleb said. "You are." Another silence. Then the sound of horses being moved. The specific sound of retreat, dressed up as tactical repositioning, and Eleanor stood at the back window and watched the third man move back into the tree line and then disappear. And she stood there until she was certain he was gone, and then she said calmly, "They're clear on the east side." Caleb checked the front. "Clear," he said. He straightened up from behind the table. He looked at her across the room in the dark. "You aimed at the fence post," he said. "Yes." "On purpose?" "Yes." "Why?" She set the rifle down carefully and turned to face him. "Because I didn't want to kill a hired hand who's probably being paid $2 to carry out someone else's grudge," she said. "I wanted to scare him. There's a difference, and I think it matters." Caleb was quiet for a long moment, standing there in the dark of his own cabin. With the table he'd moved still between them, and he was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not surprise, exactly. Something more unsettling. The look of a man who has been living with one version of the world for a very long time and has just been shown a detail he missed. "Yes," he said finally, "it does matter." He picked up the table and set it back in its place and began checking the door bolt, methodical and automatic. Eleanor went to the stove and added wood, because the fire had burned down while they were occupied, and the cold was coming back in through the log walls with its usual persistence. "They'll come back," she said. "Not tonight. Tonight they're riding to wherever Briggs has them staged and reporting in. He'll regroup." He checked the bolt one more time. "But you're right, they'll come back." "Then we need to stop reacting," Eleanor said. She turned from the stove. "We need to do something with those papers. Take the legal fight to Briggs before he comes at us again. Because the next group he sends isn't going to be 2 men and a fence post." Caleb looked at her. "The circuit judge comes through Red Hollow in 3 weeks. 3 weeks, she repeated. "Can we get to Red Hollow before Briggs gets to us?" "Not and leave the cabin unguarded." "What if we don't need to guard the cabin?" She crossed to the trunk, opened the leather folder, spread the papers on the table. She had done this enough times in the last weeks that she knew exactly where everything was. "What if we make copies of everything critical and send them somewhere safe before we move?" If the papers exist in 2 places, destroying one set doesn't help him. Caleb came to stand across the table from her. He looked at the papers, looked at her. "Where do you send the copies?" "The Land Registry Office in Denver," she said. "I've been thinking about this. The original property deed with my name on it. The loan note with Thomas's signature alone, the clause if those are registered in Denver, Briggs can't make them disappear no matter what he does to us or to these copies." The word "us" landed between them without either of them acknowledging it. But Eleanor felt it, and she thought Caleb did too. The casual structural us of 2 people who had stopped thinking of themselves as separate problems. "That's a 3-day ride to the nearest telegraph station," Caleb said. "Someone would have to carry them." "Yes." "And it would have to be someone who can't be stopped by Briggs's men on the trail." "Yes." He was looking at these papers. She was looking at him. He had the expression of a man working out a problem that had more variables than he liked, which was any problem involving other human beings, which was why he had spent 15 years removing human beings from his equation. "I know someone," he said. "Old trapper, Tobias Hale. He's been operating in these mountains longer than me, and Briggs has never had occasion to notice him. He passes through here every 4 to 6 weeks, and he's due." He paused. "He should have come through 8 days ago." Could something have happened to him? Tobias is 71 years old and has survived things that would have stopped men half his age. He's probably just been delayed by weather or a particularly productive trapline. He paused again. Or Briggs's men found him. The possibility sat in the room without either of them addressing it directly, which was itself an acknowledgement. The next morning, Caleb went to find Tobias Hale. He did not ask Eleanor to stay at the cabin, which she appreciated, and which she also understood meant he trusted her to make her own decision about it. She made her decision, which was to stay, because someone needed to be with the papers, and one of them tracking the trails was strategically better than both of them tracking the trails. He left at dawn. She watched him go through the door, and then turned to the papers on the table, and spent the morning doing what she had been trained by years of necessity to do, reading every document, every clause, every signature, every date, looking for the thing she had missed. Looking for the sharper argument. She found it at 11 o'clock in the morning. It was in the property tax records. She'd brought a single page she had never looked at closely because she'd been focused on the loan documents. The property taxes for their farm had been paid in full for 3 years before Thomas died, paid not by Thomas, but by a land company whose name she recognized, Briggs Continental Holdings, which meant Walter Briggs had been paying the taxes on their property for 3 years, which meant Walter Briggs had a legal claim of interest in the property that predated the loan, which meant this was never about the debt at all. She sat very still at that table for a full minute, the paper in her hands, reading it again and again, verifying each element the way she'd verified Clause 7, slowly, completely, without the wish to find something different distorting what was actually there. Walter Briggs had engineered the whole thing. The loan, the debt, Thomas's death, and she pressed that thought down hard because she could not afford it yet. Could not afford to let it become real yet, or at least the circumstances that followed Thomas's death. Briggs had been positioning himself to take their land for 3 years before the loan was ever signed. He had paid the taxes to establish a legal footprint, and then when Thomas took the loan, Briggs had that as the trigger, and the death had simply accelerated his timeline. She was still sitting there with the paper in her hands when Caleb came back. She heard his boots and was standing by the time the door opened, and he read her face before she said a word. He came to the table. She put the tax record in front of him. He read it. He read it again. He set it down very carefully. "He's been planning this for 3 years, Eleanor said. "At least 3, Caleb said. He was using the voice she'd heard from him only a few times, quiet and very even, the voice that came out when the situation was serious enough that emotion would cost him something. "Eleanor, I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it straight." She looked at him. "Tell me." Tobias didn't get delayed by weather. Her heart dropped. "What happened? I found him at the South Camp. He's alive, but 2 of Briggs's men found him 2 weeks ago and made it clear that anyone who helped you or me or carried anything out of these mountains was going to regret it." He paused. "They broke 2 of his fingers." The rage that moved through Eleanor was clean and cold, and nothing like what she'd expected rage to feel like. She had expected it to be hot. This was the opposite, a clarifying cold, like altitude air. Like the moment in the Mercantile when she'd understood that Briggs was not going to look at Clause 7 no matter what she said. "Is he all right?" she said. "He'll heal. He's tougher than the mountain." Caleb paused. "But it means Briggs anticipated that we'd try to move the papers. It means he's been watching this cabin and the trails around it longer than we knew." "Then whoever came 2 nights ago wasn't a surprise visit," Eleanor said. "That was planned." "Yes." "He's been building toward something." "Yes." She picked up the tax record and held it between them. "So was I," she said. "Look at the date on this." He looked again. Something shifted in his face. "That's 14 days before Thomas took out the loan. Which means Thomas didn't take out the loan because he needed money," Eleanor said, and her voice was steady, steadier than she would have predicted, because the cold clarity was still there holding her up. "He took out the loan because Briggs offered it to him, and Briggs offered it to him because Briggs already had a legal interest in the land through these tax payments, and the loan would give him a second claim and a faster route to ownership if Thomas ever defaulted." "He set your husband up," Caleb said. "He set my husband up," Eleanor confirmed. "And Thomas didn't know. He thought he was borrowing from a man who was being generous. He thought—" She stopped. She pressed her hand flat on the table. She breathed. "He told me he thought he'd made a mistake. He didn't know what the mistake was. He just felt it." Caleb put his hand over hers on the table. Not a romantic gesture, a steadying one. The way you put your hand on something to stop it from shaking. She felt the weight of it and was grateful for it in a way she couldn't have explained to anyone who hadn't stood where she was standing. "This changes what we do next," he said. "This changes everything," she said. "This isn't a debt dispute anymore. This is fraud. This is deliberate fraud, planned over 3 years, and I have the documentation for all of it." She looked at him. "This isn't something we can handle in a circuit court with a friendly judge. We need a federal land office. We need Denver." 3 days minimum," Caleb said. "And we can't both go." "Why not?" "Because if we both go, Briggs will have men at this cabin within 24 hours, and the cabin will be empty, and there'll be no witnesses to what they do to it." He looked at her steadily. "And because if we both leave together, he'll have men on the trail between here and the pass, and 2 people are harder to move quietly than 1. She understood immediately. She also didn't like it. "One of us goes," she said. "One of us goes," he confirmed. "I should go," she said. "They're my documents. I'm the plaintiff if this goes to a federal court. My name is on the deed. My argument carries more legal weight with the land office if I present it in person. You'd be traveling alone on a trail where Briggs already has men watching. You taught me to shoot. I taught you to shoot at a fence post at 30 yards in good light. You taught me more than that," she said. "And you know it." He looked at her for a long time. She held his gaze. This was, she understood, one of those moments that would be a pivot, a before and after that, divided the story of the next weeks, and possibly the next years, into two distinct sections. She felt the weight of it clearly. "There's another option," Caleb said slowly. "Tell me. Both of us go, but not on the main trail." He put his hand on the map he kept folded on the shelf, spread it on the table between them. "There's a secondary route. Old Hunting Trail runs north before cutting west. Briggs's men don't know about it because almost nobody does. Tobias showed it to me in winter of '72. He traced a line with his finger. "It adds a full day to the trip, hard going in parts, but it misses every watching point Briggs could have set between here and the pass." Eleanor looked at the map. She thought about the cabin empty behind them. She thought about the tax record in her hand. The fraud it represented, the 3 years of deliberate engineering it documented. She thought about Thomas saying quietly in their kitchen that he thought he'd made a mistake, not knowing that the mistake had been arranged for him by a man who had been patient and methodical and completely without mercy. She thought about 2 broken fingers on a 71-year-old man who had been minding his own business on his own trapline. "We leave at first light," she said. "We leave at first light," he agreed. And then, because it needed to be said, Eleanor said it. "Caleb, whatever happens in Denver, whatever a federal judge decides or doesn't decide, Briggs is not going to accept a legal ruling and quietly go away. You know that. I know that. So this isn't just about the papers. The papers are the beginning. But when we come back from Denver," he said, and his voice was the voice of a man who had spent 15 years in the mountains, learning exactly what it meant to see a thing clearly and deal with it directly. "Briggs is going to find out that paying taxes on someone else's land and breaking an old man's fingers is a very different kind of problem than the kind he's used to solving." She looked at him. The fire was behind him, and his face was in the partial shadow of it, and she thought not for the first time that this man was nothing like what she'd expected when she'd stood in Briggs' Mercantile and said, "Take me with you." She had expected a refuge. She had gotten something more complicated and more necessary than a refuge. She had gotten a partner. "Get some sleep," he said. "Tomorrow's going to be long." "I'll sleep when Briggs is in front of a federal court," she said. "Eleanor? I'll sleep well before that," she corrected, "but that's the goal." Something moved across his face, quick as light, and she recognized it now for what it was. Not quite a smile. The internal version of a smile, the one that came from something genuinely felt and not performed. She had started to understand that with Caleb, the internal version was the real one, and the fact that she could read it now after 3 weeks meant something she was not yet ready to name. She put the tax record back in the leather folder with the other documents. She put the folder into the pack she'd already begun assembling in her mind. She went to the loft and lay down in the dark and stared at the ceiling and thought about Denver and the circuit court and a federal land office and Walter Briggs's careful, methodical 3-year plan and what it was going to mean to dismantle it, document by document in front of people with the authority to act on what they found. And underneath all of that quieter, she thought about Caleb's hand on hers on the table. The simple, steadying weight of it. The way it had not been a gesture of affection, but had somehow been more intimate than affection. The way it had said, without any words at all, "I see you standing here, and you are not standing here alone." She slept 4 hours, clean and deep, no dreams. In the morning the mountain was waiting, and so was everything that came next. They left before the sky was fully light. Eleanor had the leather folder wrapped in oilcloth and packed tight against her body inside her coat, the way Caleb had shown her to carry anything that couldn't get wet. She had the rifle across her back, and the small revolver Caleb had pressed into her hand the night before, tucked in the right pocket of her trail coat. loaded safety on grip familiar enough after 3 weeks of handling that her fingers settled around it without thinking. She had dried meat, hard biscuit, 2 canteens, and the wool blanket rolled tight behind the saddle. She had everything she needed, and nothing she didn't. Caleb checked the cabin one last time, the way a man checks a thing he loves without performing the love of it. He ran his hand along the doorframe. He checked the bolt was set. He stood for one moment with his back to her, and she understood he was saying something without words to a place that had held his grief for 15 years, something private that she had no business hearing. She looked away. She gave him that. Then he mounted, and they rode north into the pre-dawn dark, and the mountain closed behind them like water closing over a stone. The North Trail was not a trail in any sense Eleanor had previously understood the word. It was a suggestion. A series of places where Caleb had clearly passed before, and the land had accepted the passage without quite encouraging it. She rode directly behind him, watching his horse's body language the way he'd taught her, letting the mare read the terrain rather than fighting it. There were 2 places in the first hour where the grade was steep enough that she leaned forward over the mare's neck and let her find her own feet, which the mare did with the patient competence of an animal that had been doing hard things her whole life. She thought about the tax record folded into the oilcloth inside her coat. She thought about Walter Briggs waking up this morning in Red Hollow, well-rested, confident in his strategy, unaware that she had found the piece of paper that turned his careful 3-year plan into evidence of federal fraud. She thought about how much he had underestimated her, not because she was difficult to read, but because he had never once tried to read her. She was the widow. She was the debtor. She was the problem with a face that needed managing. He had never once considered that she could read. He was going to find out. The first hour passed in concentrated silence, both of them managing horses and terrain and the particular cold of a mountain morning. Then the trail flattened briefly into a section of dense timber, and Caleb pulled up and held a hand back. The specific gesture she had learned meant stop and be quiet, and let me read what's ahead of us. She pulled up. She listened. She heard it after a moment. Horses. Somewhere to the west, moving south, which was toward the main trail. Moving with purpose, but not urgency. She counted what she could hear. 2, maybe 3 animals. Caleb turned slightly. Briggs's men heading back to the main trail from a night watch, he said quietly. They don't know this route. They'll cross south of us. How far south? Half a mile. Maybe more. He watched the sound track across the distance and diminish. He waited a full 2 minutes after it was gone. All right, move. She moved, and she noted not for the first time that he did not tell her to stay calm or not to worry. He gave her information and trusted her to use it. She had spent her life around men who told her not to worry. The difference was enormous. By mid-morning, they were past the point where the North Trail connected back toward the main route, which Caleb said was the most likely ambush window, and once past it, his posture changed fractionally. Not relaxed exactly. Caleb Thornton did not appear to have a relaxed setting, but the specific sharpened readiness of the last 2 hours moderated slightly, and he allowed the horses to breathe at a walking pace and finally spoke in a normal volume. You did well back there, he said. I didn't do anything. I followed your lead. That's what I mean, he said. You did exactly what was needed and nothing extra. That takes more discipline than most people have. She rode beside him for a moment, considering this. Thomas used to say I had the self-control of a woman who'd been told too many times what she was allowed to feel, she said. Caleb said nothing, but she felt him processing it the way she could always feel him doing that, taking in information and holding it without rushing to respond. He was right, she said, but I think he thought it was a sadness. I don't anymore. What do you think it is? A skill, she said, like shooting. He made the sound that was his version of a laugh, the one that had started as a single exhale in the mercantile store, and had been gradually acquiring more texture over 3 weeks of proximity. She found she had become quietly invested in that sound. In the small increments by which it became more itself, they stopped to water the horses at a creek crossing. Eleanor dismounted, took out the hard biscuit handed half to Caleb without asking. He took it without comment. They stood on opposite sides of the horses, eating in the cold air, and Eleanor looked east where the mountains folded away into distances that had no town in them, no Briggs, no debt note, no borrowed time. "Can I ask you something I've been thinking about for 3 weeks?" she said. "You've been thinking about something for 3 weeks without asking it. I was waiting to see if I still thought it was worth asking. And it is." She wrapped her hands around her canteen. "When you saw me in that store, when you put your hand on your revolver and said let her go, was that about me specifically, or would you have done that for anyone?" Caleb was quiet long enough that she thought he was going to say the diplomatic version, the version that let them both off the hook. Then he said both. "And I've been trying to figure out which one matters more." She looked at him over the horses. "What have you figured out?" "That I'm not sure the distinction is as meaningful as I thought," he said. "I've watched a lot of people get treated badly in my life, and I've never put my hand on my revolver before. I just minded my own business, so something was different that day." He looked at the water moving over the stones below them. "I haven't identified what yet." She nodded slowly. "All right," she said. "That's it," he said. "All right. You gave me an honest answer," she said. "I don't need it to be more than it is." He looked at her with that expression she'd been accumulating over 3 weeks, the one that sat somewhere between recognition and something she had not yet named. He looked at her, and then he looked away, and they finished eating, and remounted, and continued west. The twist arrived at midday, in the last form Eleanor would have predicted. They were 2 hours from the foothill town of Gentry, which was where Caleb said they could find the telegraph office that would connect them to Denver. The trail had widened to something that deserved the name, and the horses were moving at a good pace when Caleb suddenly pulled up hard, and Eleanor pulled up a half-second behind him, her hand already on the revolver in her pocket. Sitting on a rock at the side of the trail was a man Eleanor recognized. She recognized him because she had seen him 3 times in Red Hollow in the month before Thomas died. Always in Briggs's store, always in quiet conversation with Briggs. A thin man in his 50s, with a clerk's hands and a lawyer's stillness. He had a rifle across his knees, but it was pointed at the ground. He held up one hand. Empty. "I'm not here to stop you," he said. Caleb had his rifle out. "Then what are you here for?" "My name is Arthur Kell," the man said. "I'm a land attorney. I've been Briggs's attorney for 9 years. He paused. "I was his attorney until 2 days ago." Eleanor felt the shift immediately, the realignment of forces that changed what something meant. She kept the revolver in her pocket, but her hand stayed on it. "Why until 2 days ago?" she said. Kell looked at her. "Because 2 days ago I found out that Briggs didn't just defraud your husband with the loan," he said. "He defrauded me too. I drew up those documents in good faith. I did not know about the tax payments. I did not know he'd been building a legal interest in the property for 3 years before the loan. If I had known, I would not have drafted the note, because that arrangement is federal fraud, and I am not willing to be an accessory to federal fraud, regardless of what I'm being paid." Silence. A bird passed overhead. The horses shifted. "Why should we believe you?" Caleb said. "Because I'm sitting on a rock on a trail I had no reason to know about with a rifle pointed at the ground and both hands visible," Kell said. "If I were here to stop you, I would have brought more men and better planning." "How did you know about this trail?" Eleanor said. "Tobias Hale told me. He was my client before he was Briggs's target, and when Briggs's men broke his fingers, he came to me. I'm the one who told him to find you. I've been trying to get ahead of Briggs for the last week." He reached into his coat slowly visibly and produced a folded set of papers. "These are my copies of the original documents, including 3 letters from Briggs to his accountant that I retained as standard practice. Those letters describe the tax payment strategy in his own words, written 3 years ago." He held them out. Eleanor got down from her horse. Caleb stayed mounted rifle across the saddle, watching Kell with the flat attention of a man who was reserving judgment without surrendering it. Eleanor walked to Kell and took the papers. She opened them. She read. She read for 4 minutes. She turned pages carefully. She read Briggs's handwriting in those letters, the precise, methodical handwriting of a man who planned things, thoroughly describing in plain language his intention to establish a tax payment interest in the Whitaker property and then use a subsequent loan to create a foreclosure trigger. Describing Thomas Whitaker as an uncomplicated target. Using that specific phrase, uncomplicated target, to describe her dead husband, who had stood in their kitchen and said quietly that he thought he'd made a mistake. Her hands did not shake. The cold clarity was back sharper than ever. She folded the papers. She looked at Kell. "You understand that if this goes to a federal court, you'll have to testify," she said. "I understand." "Briggs will come after you." "Briggs is already after me," Kell said. "When I tendered my resignation 2 days ago, he did not take it professionally." He showed her his left arm, where the coat sleeve had a tear she now understood was not from the trail. "I'd rather take my chances with a federal court than with a man who just demonstrated what his patience looks like when it runs out." Eleanor turned to Caleb. He was watching her, not Kell, reading her face, her posture, the set of her shoulders. He trusted her read on this more than his own because she had spent more time in town with these men and knew the texture of their behavior. She gave him a single nod. He lowered the rifle. "Get a horse," he said to Kell. "You're coming to Gentry with us." Kell had a horse. Of course he did. He retrieved it from 20 feet off the trail where he'd tied it, mounted with the slightly effortful grace of a man who was an attorney and not a horseman, and fell in behind them. Eleanor rode up beside Caleb. "Do you believe him?" Caleb said quietly. "The letters are real," she said. "I've seen enough forged documents in Thomas's paperwork to know what real looks like. And the handwriting matches what I've seen on Briggs's correspondence before." She paused. "I believe him, but I'm going to watch him all the way to Gentry." "So will I," Caleb said. They rode. Gentry was a small town, smaller than Red Hollow, built around a trading post and a way station for the stage line. It had a telegraph office, which was what they needed, and a land office with a federal charter, which was more than they'd hoped for. Eleanor had prepared to send documents to Denver by telegraph description and follow up in person. Finding a federal land office in Gentry changed their options considerably. The federal land agent was a man named Hargrove, 50 years old, with the unhurried manner of a government employee who had seen enough disputes that very little surprised him anymore. Eleanor laid out her papers in front of him in order and walked him through them in the voice she had practiced in front of the mirror, clear and steady and free of sentiment, building the legal argument from foundation to conclusion. "The way you build a case, not the way you tell a story," Hargrove read. He asked 3 questions. Eleanor answered all 3 precisely. Then he looked at Kell's letters. He read them twice. He set them down. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said, "I need to ask you something directly." "Go ahead." "Are you aware that Walter Briggs has a brother-in-law who serves as a deputy district clerk in Jefferson County?" She had not known that. She felt it land. "No," she said, "because what you're describing is not something I can handle through county channels," Hargrove said. "What you're describing is a federal matter, and the reason it needs to be federal is specifically because Briggs has positioned himself very carefully in the local legal landscape." He looked at the tax records again. "This is not an isolated fraud. This is a pattern. And I've seen this pattern before, Mrs. Whitaker, in 2 other counties in Colorado in the last 5 years. Different names, different properties, same structure." The room got very quiet. Caleb said from his position by the door, where he'd been standing since they came in, "Same man." Hargrove looked at him. "I can't confirm that today, but I can tell you that I've been trying to build a federal case against a land speculation operation in this region for 3 years, and what this woman just put on my desk is the first time I've had documentation instead of testimony." He looked at Eleanor. "Mrs. Whitaker, your husband was not Briggs's first uncomplicated target. He was just the one who happened to marry someone who could read." Eleanor sat with that for a moment. The grief came at her sideways the way it did, sometimes not the dull, persistent ache, but the sharp, specific kind, the kind that arrived when something made Thomas reel again in a way she couldn't brace against. He was not her first uncomplicated target. He was just the one who happened to marry someone who could read. She pressed her hand flat on the table. She breathed. "What do you need from me?" she said. Hargrove leaned forward. "Everything you have. And your testimony. And that attorney's cooperation." He glanced at Kell. "And time. A federal investigation takes time." "How much time?" "Weeks. Possibly months. And in the meantime, Briggs is in Red Hollow, and he's already sent men to the mountain twice, and he's going to keep coming." She held Hargrove's gaze. What protection exists while a federal investigation proceeds at its own pace? Hargrove was quiet a moment. "I can issue a federal hold on the property. No transfer of ownership can be legally executed while the hold is active. That limits what Briggs can accomplish legally." He paused. "What he can accomplish outside of legally is a separate question." "I know what that means," Eleanor said. "I thought you might." She looked at Caleb. He was looking back at her. In the 2 days of riding and the long afternoon in this office, something had settled between them. Not into comfort exactly, but into a clearer shape. Two people who had stopped pretending they were operating independently. She could see in his face that he had already been calculating the problem she was calculating, the weeks or months of federal process during which Briggs remained operational and dangerous, and increasingly aware that the walls were closing. "There's a cabin on a mountain," she said to Hargrove. "It's defensible. I know because we've already defended it once." She paused. "I assume a federal investigation doesn't require me to be in a specific location while it proceeds." "No, ma'am." "Then we go back," she said. She turned to Kell. "You're not coming back with us. You're staying in Gentry where Briggs can't reach you easily, and where you're accessible to the federal investigator. Can you do that?" Kell looked slightly startled at being given instructions by the woman Briggs had called a widow with no standing. He recovered himself. "Yes," he said. "I have resources. I can stay." "Good." She turned to Hargrove. "Issue the hold today. I want the paperwork in my hands before we leave." "It'll take an hour," Hargrove said. "We'll be at the trading post," she said. She gathered her papers, stood, and walked out of the land office into the afternoon air with the posture of a woman who had just done something irrevocable and was entirely at peace with it. Caleb fell into step beside her without comment. They walked the length of the one main street of Gentry in silence. She could feel him beside her, the particular quality of his presence that she had calibrated to over weeks, the steadiness of it. "You ran that meeting," he said. "Someone had to. Hargrove's a federal agent." Hargrove needed the information organized in a specific order and a specific tone, she said. "I've had more practice with that than he has." They reached the trading post. He held the door. She went in. They bought coffee and sat at the single table the trading post offered, and the proprietor brought 2 cups and left them alone with the wisdom of someone who recognized the atmosphere. Eleanor wrapped both hands around her cup. She looked at the table. She said, "He called Thomas an uncomplicated target." "I know," Caleb said. "Thomas was the most trusting man I have ever known," she said. "He believed that people operated in good faith because he operated in good faith. He didn't have a suspicious bone in his body." She paused. "I used to think that was a weakness. I would get frustrated with him sometimes. I'd say, Thomas, not everyone is honest. You have to be more careful." She stopped. "I was wrong about the weakness. The weakness was in Briggs. Thomas was exactly who he was. Briggs just exploited it." Caleb said nothing. He let her say it. He did not try to redirect her or comfort her or move the conversation past the grief. He simply stayed in it with her, which was what she actually needed, and she thought that perhaps this was the most underrated of all human skills, the ability to stay with someone in a difficult moment without trying to make the moment end. "He would have liked you," she said finally. "I doubt it," Caleb said. "Why?" "Because I am not particularly likable." "That's not true," she said. "You're extremely likable. You're just not easy. Those are different things. She looked up at him. Thomas liked people who weren't easy. He found easy people boring. He used to say that the people worth knowing had at least one thing about them that didn't cooperate. Caleb turned his cup in his hands. What was his thing? He said. His hope, Eleanor said. He hoped constantly and entirely against evidence. He could lose a harvest and believe in the next season. He could have a bad year and believe in the next one. It was impractical and sometimes exhausting, and it is absolutely why Briggs was able to do what he did. She paused. And it is also why I married him. Because hope, even impractical hope, is not a small thing to live next to. Caleb looked at her. The afternoon light was in the window, and it touched his face in a way that made him look less defended than usual. No, he said. It isn't. She said carefully, because it needed to be said carefully, what was your thing that didn't cooperate? A long pause. My certainty, he said. I have always been very certain about things. Margaret said it was my best quality and my worst one simultaneously. She said I could be certain about the wrong things just as completely as the right ones. He paused. She was correct. What were you certain about that you got wrong? He was quiet so long she thought he wasn't going to answer. That I was better off alone, he said. After she died. After Clara died. I was very certain that the best thing I could do was make sure no one else got close enough to be lost. He paused again. I was wrong about that. I'm not certain how I know I was wrong, but I know. The coffee was cooling. The afternoon was moving. In an hour, Hargrove would have their paperwork, and they would need to think about where to spend the night before the 2-day ride back up the mountain. None of that felt as immediate as this table, and this conversation, and the 2 cups between them. Eleanor said, When you said you were going to get me set up somewhere safe and come back up to the mountain alone, was that what you actually wanted to do? The pause this time was the longest yet. No, he said. What did you want to do? He looked at her steadily. I wanted you to stay, he said. I recognized very quickly that I wanted you to stay, and I spent a significant amount of energy telling myself that what I wanted was irrelevant, and that the practical and decent thing was to get you somewhere safe and return to the life I had, which was functional, and which I had made functional deliberately, and which had the significant advantage of not putting anyone He stopped. Eleanor waited. Not putting anyone at risk, he said, finishing with the safer word. But they both heard the one that had been coming before it, and it sat between them on the table, alongside the cooling coffee, not named but entirely present. She said, I want to stay. He looked at her. I want to stay on the mountain, she said. Not because I have nowhere else to go. I have options now. Hargrove would help me establish somewhere. Kell owes me his cooperation. I have the documentation and the legal standing, and with a federal hold on the property I have time. She held his gaze. I want to stay because the cabin doesn't feel empty to me, the way it apparently used to feel to you, and because I have become invested in a coffee shelf argument that I feel strongly I could win if given another few months. Something happened to his face. Something cracked open very slightly, the way a winter thaw cracks ice. Not breaking it, not changing its essential nature, just releasing the pressure that had been building since the last time it was warm. She saw it happen, and she held very still, the way you hold still when something is coming out of the dark and you don't want to frighten it back in. The coffee stays on the right shelf, he said. We'll discuss it, she said. There is nothing to discuss, he said. The bottom shelf will freeze it. In winter, she said. In summer it would be fine. It's the principle, he said. Your principle, she said. My cabin, he said. For now, she said. And there it was. The smallest, most domestic argument possible about a shelf and coffee, and the temperature of a storage room, and it was the conversation that changed everything between them more completely than anything they had said about grief, or loneliness, or what they wanted. Because it presumed a future. Because it said for now rather than goodbye. Because it was the conversation of people who intended to continue arguing about this, about all of it, for the foreseeable future. Caleb looked at her. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "The right shelf holds more too. There's more space." "That's a completely separate argument, and you know it," she said. "I'm just noting," he said. "You're deflecting," she said. "I don't deflect," he said. "You absolutely deflect," she said. "You do it by introducing practical information when the conversation gets to something you'd rather not address directly." He looked at her. "That's a very specific observation. I've had 3 weeks," she said. "I pay attention." The proprietor came to refill their cups. Read the atmosphere, set the pot down, and left without pouring. They both noticed, and neither mentioned it. Caleb said quietly, "Eleanor." "Yes." "I'm not good at this." "At what specifically?" "At..." He made a gesture that encompassed vaguely everything around them and between them and ahead of them. "At this." "I know," she said. "You've been alone for 15 years. I've been a widow for 5 months. Between the two of us, we have approximately no experience with what happens when people decide to..." She paused. "When people decide to continue." "Continue," he said. "That's what you're calling it." "For now," she said. "Until we figure out a better word." He looked at her for a long time. The afternoon was losing its light outside the window. Somewhere in Gentry, a horse was being shod, and the ring of the smith's hammer came through the walls in a regular rhythm. "I have to tell you something," he said. Her heart shifted. "Tell me, when Briggs's men came to the cabin that first night, and you aimed at the fence post." He looked at the table. "That was the moment I stopped thinking about how to get you somewhere safe and started thinking about something else." "What were you thinking about?" "That I had not thought about tomorrow in 15 years, he said. And there I was thinking about it, not even deliberately. Just, he turned his cup. Just that tomorrow was a thing that was going to happen and it had something in it worth looking at. Eleanor felt that land in the center of her chest in the specific place where the grief lived. The place she had been carefully managing since Thomas died. She felt it land and sit there and change the temperature of the thing it landed on. Not replacing it, not displacing it, coexisting with it. The way new things and old things coexist in a person who has been through enough to understand that neither one cancels the other. She said, "Caleb." "Yes, when we get back to the mountain and the federal case is proceeding and Briggs is still..." She paused. "There's going to be more difficulty. He's not going to go quietly." "I know that. And I need you to understand that I'm not asking you to fight my battles." "I know that too." "I'm asking you to fight them with me," she said. "That's different." He looked at her with everything he had, which she had come to understand was considerable, more than the surface of him, suggested more than the mountain, and the silence, and the 15 years of deliberate distance indicated. He looked at her with all of it. "Yes," he said. "It is." Hargrove's paperwork was ready when they returned to the land office. Eleanor signed 3 copies and kept one folded inside the oilcloth with the other documents. Kell was installed at the Gentry boarding house with instructions to cooperate fully with the federal investigation and to contact Hargrove directly if Briggs or his men made any approach. They bought supplies for the return trip at the trading post. Caleb added coffee to the list, a larger quantity than usual, and said nothing about it. Eleanor added a second skillet, smaller than his, better for cornbread, and also said nothing about it. The proprietor wrapped their purchases, and they loaded the horses in the early evening with the comfortable efficiency of 2 people who had learned each other's rhythms without negotiating them. As they prepared to make camp at the edge of town before the early start back, Eleanor took out the leather folder one more time. She removed the tax record and held it for a moment in the last of the evening light. The document that had changed everything, the single page that had converted a debt dispute into a federal fraud case, that had converted Walter Briggs from a local bully with legal cover into a man whose 3-year strategy was about to be dismantled by a widow who could read. "Thomas," she thought, "you married someone who could read, and you didn't know it was going to matter this much." She put it back. She closed the folder. She tucked it inside her coat next to her heartbeat, where she'd carried it all day. "Ready," Caleb said. "Ready," she said. They made camp. The fire came up quickly under his hands. She made supper from what they'd bought, and he ate everything and poured a second cup of coffee and looked at the fire. Normal. Entirely normal. And also nothing like anything that had ever been normal before for either of them. She said from across the fire, "The bottom shelf." He looked at her. I thought about it more. The bottom shelf in summer is actually relevant because the temperatures in the cabin still drop significantly at night even in July, and it would be risky in May and September regardless. So you may have a point. He was quiet for a moment. "Are you conceding?" "I'm gathering evidence," she said. "There's a difference." "In your case," he said, "I'm beginning to think there isn't." She smiled. He looked at the fire. And the night came down around them in the Rockies with its cold and its stars, and its complete indifference to the human drama playing out in its terrain, and somewhere below them, in Red Hollow, Walter Briggs was going about his evening unaware that a federal hold had been issued on his most valuable asset, and that his own handwritten letters were sitting in a government land office with a federal agent who had been waiting 3 years for exactly this kind of documentation. And somewhere above them, on a mountain that had held grief for 15 years, there was a cabin with 2 chairs and a shelf of women's novels and a coffee shelf on the right side and a small growing patch of notes for a garden by the creek, waiting for them to come home. The ride back up the mountain took 2 days and changed something between them that neither of them named directly. It was not one moment. It was an accumulation. The way he pulled up beside her on the narrow sections instead of riding ahead so that she didn't have to watch his back and wonder what was in front of them. The way she started reading the trail ahead of her horse without being reminded, calling out the loose shale and the ice-slicked creek crossings with the casual accuracy of someone who had absorbed a skill completely. The way they stopped talking about the case somewhere in the middle of the first day and started talking about other things, small things, the kind of things that fill the hours between people who are simply in each other's company without agenda. He told her about the winter of '76 when the snow came so deep that he couldn't leave the cabin for 11 days and had read every book on the shelf twice and then started reading them again, and how by the end he had opinions about novels he'd never expected to have. She asked which one he'd read most. He said without apparent embarrassment, a love story Margaret had brought up the mountain in the summer of '68, a novel about 2 people in England who kept missing each other for 300 pages. She asked if they finally stopped missing each other. He said yes on page 312, and he had found it entirely believable by that point, because 300 pages was approximately how long it took 2 people to stop being afraid of the same thing at the same time. Eleanor looked at him when he said that. He was watching the trail. She said, "Is that a commentary?" He said, "It's a book report." She said, "Caleb." He said, "Eleanor." They rode another mile before she said, 312 pages is a long time to be afraid. "It is," he agreed. But they got there. She looked at the trail ahead and she was smiling and she didn't try to stop it, which was itself something new. For the last 5 months, she had managed her expressions the way she managed her breathing at altitude, deliberately conserving, not spending what she didn't have. She had smiled when she needed to, and not when she didn't. And the difference had been easy to calculate, because there was very little that warranted the genuine article. Now the genuine article was arriving without her permission, and she found she didn't mind. They made camp the second night on familiar ground, a clearing Caleb had used before, and she made supper while he saw to the horses. And when he came and sat across the fire, she handed him his plate, and their fingers touched on the edge of it, and neither of them moved for a full second before she let go. He said nothing. She said nothing. They ate. But the second afterward sat in the air between them like a note held past its expected duration. She slept well again. She had been sleeping well since the first night on the mountain, and she thought she understood it now. It was not that the mountain was safe. It was not safe. She had learned exactly how unsafe it was in specific and practical detail. It was that she was sleeping next to someone whose attention didn't stop when he closed his eyes, and some part of her nervous system had recognized this and decided it could rest. She woke before dawn with her hand on the leather folder and the certain feeling that something was wrong. Not inside the camp. The horses were quiet, which was the first thing she checked. Caleb was already awake, already sitting up, which told her the feeling was not only hers. "What is it?" she said quietly. "Smoke," he said. "From the north. Too much for a campfire." She was on her feet. "How far?" "An hour, maybe less." He was already breaking camp with the speed of a man who had made fast decisions in the dark before. "Eleanor, that's the direction of the cabin." She didn't say anything. She rolled her blanket and secured it, and had the mare's saddle on before he'd finished with his own horse, and she felt the cold of it. Not the mountain cold, but the other kind, the one that lived in the chest and had nothing to do with temperature. They rode hard. The smoke was visible before the cabin was a thick column against the pre-dawn gray, and Eleanor tracked it with her eyes and her heart, and the practical part of her that was already calculating damage versus loss versus what could be rebuilt and what couldn't. She had the leather folder against her body, and she pressed her arm against it once, instinctively confirming. The cabin was standing. The barn was not. Caleb pulled up 30 yards out in the trees, and she pulled up beside him, and they both sat still reading the situation. The barn had been set deliberately. She could see that from the way the fire had caught at multiple points simultaneously. But the cabin itself was untouched, which meant whoever had done this had either been interrupted or had intended to send a message rather than destroy everything. Caleb said very quietly, "2 horses, south side of the cabin. They're still here." Eleanor saw them the moment he named them. Tied to the fence post, she had aimed at what felt like a long time ago. 2 horses standing with the patience of animals that had been told to wait and were waiting. "They wanted us to come back to this," she said. "They wanted us to come back and find the barn gone and them waiting." "Yes," he said. "How many do you think?" 2 horses, probably 2 men. Briggs wouldn't send more for a message. He'd send more for a conclusion. He looked at her. "This is a message." "What's the message?" "That he can reach us up here. That federal hold or not, he can make this inconvenient enough that we give up and go away." Eleanor looked at the smoke still rising from where the barn had been. She thought about the mare which she'd brought with her, and which was currently standing safely behind them in the trees. She thought about Caleb's tools hanging on the wall inside the cabin, and Margaret's books on the shelf, and the 2 chairs at the table, where they'd eaten every meal for 3 weeks, and the garden notes she'd started making and tucking under her pillow. She thought about all of it, and she felt the rage come back clean and cold and specific. "I'm not going away," she said. "I know," he said. "So we go in." "We go in," he said, "but carefully. They're expecting us to come straight in from the trail." He turned the horse east. "We come around." They circled wide through the tree line, coming at the cabin from the east, where the angle of the rising ground gave them elevation and cover. It took 20 minutes that felt like 2 hours. When they came out of the trees on the high side, they could see the cabin door and the 2 men sitting on the porch steps with the deliberate casualness of men who had been told to wait and look relaxed, and were doing a workable impression of both. Eleanor recognized one of them. He had been in Briggs's store the day she'd quoted Clause 7, standing against the wall with his arms crossed. Big man, mid-40s, the kind of stillness that came from physical confidence rather than patience. The other was younger, thinner, with the nervous energy of someone on his first assignment who hadn't yet worked out how to pretend it was routine. Caleb said, "I'll take the big one. You have the younger." "I'm not shooting anyone," she said. "Let me talk first." He looked at her. "Eleanor." "Let me talk first," she said. "If talking doesn't work, you can do whatever comes next. But let me try." She held his gaze. "I talked our way through Hargrove's office and I negotiated Kell's cooperation, and I've been arguing legal text since before you came down from this mountain. Let me try the thing I'm actually best at before we move to the thing we're both hoping to avoid." A pause. A long one. Then, "All right," he said, "but I'm right behind you." "I know," she said. She rode out of the tree line at a steady pace that was neither aggressive nor uncertain. She kept her hands visible, not raised, just open on the reins, the posture of someone approaching a conversation. The two men on the porch steps came alert immediately. The big one stood. The younger one stood 2 seconds behind him. "Mrs. Whitaker," the big man said, not surprised. He'd been expecting her. "You have the advantage of me," she said pleasantly. "You know my name, and I don't know yours." "Dixon," he said after a moment. "Mr. Dixon, I assume you burned my barn." A pause. "Mr. Briggs asked us to deliver a message." "I got it," she said. "Barns are expensive and inconvenient to lose. I understand that." She stopped the mare 10 feet from him. "I want you to deliver a message back. Can you do that?" Dixon said nothing, which she took as a yes. The Federal Land Office in Gentry issued a hold on all property transfers relating to the Whitaker farm yesterday afternoon, she said. "Agent Hargrove has Arthur Kell's cooperation, and Kell has 3 letters in Briggs's own handwriting describing the tax payment strategy he used to establish fraudulent interest in our land over the last 3 years." She paused to let that land. She watched Dixon's face. He was good at keeping his face still, but not good enough. Not to someone who had spent 3 weeks reading Caleb Thornton. Mr. Briggs is no longer looking at a debt dispute. He's looking at a federal fraud investigation. Burning my barn doesn't change those documents. It just adds property destruction to the list of things Agent Hargrove is going to be interested in. Dixon said, "I don't know anything about any documents." "I know you don't," she said. "That's what I'm trying to help you with. Because when a federal investigation opens Mr. Dixon, the men who were following orders have a choice to make. They can claim they were following orders which help somewhat, but not completely. Or they can cooperate with the investigation early, which helps considerably more." She looked at him steadily. "You seem like a practical man. I imagine you'd like to keep working in this county after whatever happens to Briggs Continental Holdings is finished happening." The younger man behind Dixon was not doing nearly as good a job of keeping his face neutral. He was looking at Dixon with the expression of someone who was rapidly recalculating whether $2 and a message delivery was worth a federal investigation. Dixon said, "You're bluffing." "I have the federal hold document in my coat," Eleanor said. "Would you like to see it?" A silence. The smoke from the barn was thinning now, the fire having consumed what it was going to consume. Caleb was somewhere behind her, and she could feel his presence the way she'd learned to feel it, steady and ready and not interfering. Dixon looked at her for a long moment. He was doing arithmetic. She could see it happening behind his eyes, the calculation of risk and loyalty and self-interest that all practical men eventually arrived at when the situation became sufficiently clear. "Briggs isn't going to like this," he said. "Briggs is going to have significantly larger problems than his feelings about it," Eleanor said. "Mr. Dixon, I am not your enemy. I'm a woman who has been trying to keep what belongs to her, and I have now found a legal avenue to do that which does not require your cooperation or your opposition. All I'm asking is that you ride back to Red Hollow and tell Walter Briggs that the documents are with the Federal Land Office, and that burning barns is going to make things worse for him, not better." Another silence. The younger man behind Dixon cleared his throat. Dixon said, "That's the whole message." "That's the whole message," Eleanor said. "I'd also appreciate it if you didn't burn anything else on your way down." Dixon looked at her for one more long moment. Then he turned to the younger man and said, "Get the horses." He looked back at Eleanor. "You know he's going to come himself eventually. Briggs doesn't stay in town when things go this far sideways." "I know," she said. "And when he comes himself, he won't send a message." "I know that too," she said. "Thank you for telling me." Dixon studied her face for a moment, and she saw something shift in his expression that was not respect exactly, but was adjacent to it, the look of a man who has underestimated something, and is acknowledging the error without quite admitting it out loud. He put his hat on. He got his horse. And he and the younger man rode south without looking back, and Eleanor sat on the mare and watched them go until the tree line took them. Then she exhaled. Caleb rode up beside her. He said nothing for a moment. He looked at the spot where the barn had been, and then at the cabin standing intact, and then at her. "You knew he'd go," Caleb said. "I thought he would. Dixon's a hired hand, not a believer. Believers don't respond to logic. Hired hands do when the logic is clear enough." She looked at him. "Was I right to try?" "Yes," he said. And then after a pause, "You said our land." She looked at him. "To Dixon," Caleb said. "You said he used fraudulent interest in our land." She had said it without thinking. She heard it now the way it must have sounded to him, the casual structural hour of it, the same way she'd said us in Hargrove's office, the same way she'd said for now about the cabin. She felt color come to her face, which surprised her. She had thought she was past that particular reaction. She started. "Don't apologize for it," he said. She stopped. "Don't apologize," he said again, quieter. I wasn't noting an error. I was noting it because it—" He stopped himself, turned his cup in his hands, or would have if there had been a cup. He did the gesture anyway, the turning motion his hands made when he was working through something. "It sounded right," he said finally. "That's all. It sounded like the correct word." Eleanor looked at him on his horse in the morning light with the smoke clearing behind them and the cabin solid and intact in front of them. And she thought not for the first time that this man had no idea how much he communicated when he thought he was being careful. "It is the correct word," she said. He looked at her. Then he nodded once and dismounted and led his horse toward the cabin. She followed. They spent the morning assessing the damage and beginning what needed to begin. The barn was a total loss, which was a serious practical problem that they addressed, practically making a list of what had been inside it and what was irreplaceable and what could be rebuilt over the coming weeks. Caleb had 2 horses, she had the rented mare, and the immediate priority was shelter for the animals, which meant the lean-to on the cabin's north side needed to be extended and reinforced before the next weather came in. She held timbers while he cut and shaped them. She handed tools before he asked for them, having watched his process enough to know the sequence. They worked for 4 hours without stopping, and by early afternoon, the lean-to was extended enough to stable all 3 horses adequately, and Eleanor stood back and looked at what they'd built and felt the specific satisfaction of a thing done well under necessity. "You're good at this," Caleb said. "I grew up on a farm," she said. "My father believed in useful daughters." "Smart man." "He was," she said. "He died when I was 19, before I married Thomas. I think he would have had opinions about Thomas." She paused. "Good ones mostly, but opinions." Caleb sat down on the sawing log. He was tired in the way that physical work tired him honestly, and without complaint. She sat on the ground nearby and leaned against the cabin wall and stretched her legs, and they both looked at the lean-to in the late afternoon light. "What do we do now?" she said. "While Hargrove builds his case." "We wait," he said. "We watch the trail. We make this place harder to approach than it was." He looked at her. "And we prepare for when Briggs comes himself. Dixon said he would." Dixon was right. He turned a piece of cut wood in his hands. "Briggs has too much invested in this land to walk away from it because of a legal complication. He'll try to resolve it before the federal case gets traction, and resolving it for him means removing the witnesses and the evidence." He looked at her directly. "That means us." "I know," she said. "How long do we have?" "A week, maybe 2. He'll need to regroup after Dixon's report. He'll need to decide how to approach it and assemble the right people." He paused. "Men who come to conclude something, not to deliver a message." Eleanor sat with that for a moment. She thought about the rifle on the cabin wall and the revolver in her pocket, and the 3 weeks of practice she'd had, and the fact that she had at a fence post at 30 yards in the dark demonstrated sufficient accuracy to communicate a point. She thought about Caleb at the door with his rifle, and the iron bolt and the table he'd pulled across the room in 20 seconds in the dark. She thought about Thomas, who had hoped against evidence, and she thought about her own particular gift, which was not hope, but something that sat alongside it and kept it company. Clarity. The ability to see what was actually in front of her without the distortion of what she wished was there. What was actually in front of her was this. She had a federal hold on the property and a federal investigator with the documentation to build a case. And she had 2 weeks, and she had a man who had survived 15 years in these mountains through knowledge and attention, and the kind of practical competence that couldn't be faked. And she had 3 weeks of her own training and the instincts she'd always had and never been given the tools to act on. And she had the thing she'd had since she was 19 years old, and her father died. And she understood for the first time that the world did not arrange itself into fair configurations simply because you deserved fair. She had the willingness to deal with what was actually there. Then we use the 2 weeks, she said. We don't just wait for him to come. We use the time. What are you thinking? I'm thinking we send word to Tobias Hale. His fingers will be healing, and he knows this mountain better than anyone, and he's already got a grudge against Briggs that's personal and specific. She paused. I'm thinking we also send word to Hargrove and make sure he knows that Briggs is likely to make a move before the investigation gets traction, so that whatever happens up here doesn't happen without a federal officer aware of the context. She looked at Caleb. And I'm thinking we change the layout of the cabin defense, because they know the approach now. They've been watching it. Whatever we set up, it needs to account for the fact that they know where we are and how we sit. Caleb looked at her with that expression she had by now cataloged thoroughly. The one that was not surprise and not admiration, but was something that lived in the territory between them. Something that had been accumulating since a mercantile store in Red Hollow, when she'd quoted Clause 7 at a man twice her size, and then turned and asked a stranger to take her with him. All right, he said. Show me what you're thinking. They spent the next 2 days restructuring. Tobias Hale arrived on the evening of the second day with 2 splinted fingers, a rifle, and the expression of a man who had been looking for a reason to settle a score and had found one. He shook Eleanor's hand first, which she noticed, and which told her Caleb had said something to him before she came out to meet him, something that had established the correct order of things. You're the one who found the tax records, Tobias said. Yes. Caleb told me. He looked at her with the direct assessment of a man who had spent 50 years in mountains judging things quickly and accurately. Good, he said, just that. Then he went inside and began talking with Caleb about the north approach, and Eleanor went back to her notes about the cabin layout and thought that she would like Tobias Hale very much. The message to Hargrove went out through a relay. Tobias knew a system of trusted traders and trappers who could move information through the mountains faster than the stage line ran. Hargrove's response came back in 4 days. He had opened the investigation. Formally, the letters from Kell were in federal evidence, and he had notified the U.S. Marshal's office in Denver of the situation. A deputy marshal was expected in the region within 10 days. 10 days. Eleanor stood in the cabin with Hargrove's response in her hand and calculated. Briggs would have heard about the federal investigation through his brother-in-law in Jefferson County within 48 hours of it opening. He had probably already begun moving. 10 days was a window, not a guarantee. She folded the response and put it with the other documents and went to find Caleb. He was on the roof reinforcing a section of the north eave that he said gave a sightline advantage to anyone approaching from the tree line. She stood below and told him about the 10 days. He came down. He stood with her in the cold air and thought about it with his eyes on the mountains. He'll come in the next week, Caleb said. He won't wait for the marshal. I think so too. How many men? Enough to finish it, she said. Not so many that a federal officer would have trouble explaining them away as a group of concerned citizens with a legal dispute. She had been thinking about this. He'll want it to look like something it isn't. He's been careful for 3 years. He's not going to stop being careful now. So, 4 or 5 men, Caleb said. Enough force plausible framing. Yes. She looked at him. Caleb, I want you to know something before this happens. He looked at her. Whatever happens when Briggs comes, she said. I don't need you to protect me. I need you to fight with me. Do you understand the difference? He said, "I do. Because if you try to put yourself between me and this, I'm going to be angry with you." "Duly noted," he said. "I mean it." "I know you mean it." Something moved across his face, the thaw expression, the cracked ice, and underneath it something warmer and more specific than anything he'd let her see before. "Eleanor, I stopped thinking about protecting you about a week after you got here. That's not what this is." "What is it?" "Partners," he said. "Same as you said to Hargrove. Same as the deed is going to say if you're willing." He looked at her steadily. "I've been thinking about what you said at the trading post in Gentry, about continuing, about fighting together. And I've been thinking that if we're going to fight together and live on the same mountain and argue about the coffee shelf for the foreseeable future, then the structure of it should be clear." She was very still. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying the circuit judge comes through Red Hollow in 2 weeks," he said. "After the marshal and after Briggs and after whatever comes next. I'm saying that if we're going to continue—" He used her word deliberately with the faintest indication of the internal smile. "Then we should continue correctly. Formally. In a way that makes the deed say what it should say, and that gives you every legal protection a woman in your situation ought to have, and that makes it clear to everyone, including Briggs and his lawyers, that you are not a widow with a debt problem. You are—" He paused. "You are my wife. If you want to be." The wind came through the pines, and the smoke from the cabin chimney went east, and the horses moved in the lean-to, and somewhere far below them the world was continuing its regular business of being ordinary. Eleanor looked at this man who had come down from a mountain for flour and salt and ammunition, and had instead found something he hadn't planned for in the middle of a general store, in the form of a woman with a legal clause memorized and her jaw set. She said, "You are not a romantic man." "No." He agreed. "I'm not." That was arguably the least romantic proposal I have ever heard. "I don't doubt it. You cited the circuit court schedule. The timing is practical." "Caleb." "Eleanor." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about Thomas, who had hoped constantly and against evidence, and she thought that Thomas would have liked this man very much, not because they were similar, they were nothing alike, but because Thomas had believed in people who were exactly who they were without performance. And Caleb Thornton was exactly who he was, and had been, since the moment he walked into a mercantile store and said, "Let her go," and meant it. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Yes, yes," she said again. "I want to be." He nodded. Once. The nod of a man who had asked something enormous and received an answer and was filing the answer in the place where he kept things that mattered. The same place he kept Margaret's novels and Clara's memory and 15 years of learning to survive what couldn't be survived. The same place she understood that now had her coffee preference and her legal arguments and the sound of her laugh and the moment she'd aimed at a fence post in the dark and chosen mercy over damage. "All right," he said. "All right." She agreed. They stood in the mountain air for another moment, and then she said, "We should finish the roof reinforcement before the light goes." And he said yes. And they went back to work. Briggs came on the 6th day. He came himself, as Dixon had predicted, with 4 men who had the look of people hired to conclude things rather than deliver messages. He came up the main trail in the early morning, not trying to be quiet about it, which Eleanor understood immediately was itself a statement. He was done with subtlety. He had a federal investigation opening around him, and a marshal incoming, and a legal structure crumbling, and he had decided to resolve the physical reality before the legal one could catch up. What he found at the cabin was not what he expected. He expected a mountain man and a widow. He found Tobias Hale positioned on the high ground to the north with a clear line on the trail approach. He found the cabin with its windows oriented to give interior angles that his men couldn't account for from the outside. He found Eleanor Whitaker standing on the porch with a rifle and the posture of someone who had been waiting. And he found Caleb Thornton not inside the cabin, not on the roof, not where any of the standard calculations would have put him, but coming out of the tree line 30 yards to the east, having been there since before dawn, which was the other thing Eleanor and Caleb had discussed and planned and prepared for the understanding that when someone came to conclude something, you did not wait for them to set the terms. Briggs pulled up. He looked at the porch. He looked at the tree line. He had a moment that Eleanor, watching his face, recognized as the moment a man understands that the situation is not what he planned for and is calculating whether to proceed anyway. He decided to try words first. She gave him credit for that. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said, "this doesn't have to be difficult. It became difficult 3 years ago when you started paying taxes on my land without my knowledge," she said. "I'd say you made it difficult, Mr. Briggs." A pause. "Whatever that federal agent told you." "Agent Hargrove told me a federal investigation is open and a deputy marshal is expected in this region within 4 days, she said. "He told me your letters are in federal evidence and that Arthur Kell has provided his full cooperation in exchange for consideration." She watched his face as Kell's name landed. "I also told Hargrove to expect that you would make a physical approach to the property before the investigation concluded. He agreed that was likely and asked me to note the date, time, and names of all parties present if such an approach occurred." She paused. "So, for the record, today is the 14th of October, 1884. It is approximately 7 in the morning. Your name is Walter Briggs. Would you like to introduce your associates?" The man to Briggs's left said something under his breath. The man to his right shifted in the saddle. The calculation was happening again across 4 faces. This time, the same arithmetic Dixon had done, the risk and loyalty calculation that all practical hired men eventually ran. Briggs was not a hired man. Briggs was a believer. He had invested 3 years in this, and he was looking at a woman on a porch who was naming dates and times in front of witnesses. And he made the decision that Eleanor had known he might make the decision of a man who could not accept that the thing he had built so carefully was coming apart. He came off his horse. He took 2 steps toward the porch, and Tobias's rifle cracked from the high ground, not at Briggs, but at the ground 6 feet in front of him, close enough to kick dirt onto his boots, and he stopped. Caleb came out of the tree line. He walked steadily, not fast the way he walked when he was completely certain of what he was doing, and there was no urgency because the outcome was already determined. He came to stand beside Eleanor on the porch steps, and he looked at Walter Briggs across the 6 feet of Colorado morning between them. "You burned my barn," Caleb said. Briggs said, "You interfered with my—" "You burned my barn," Caleb said again. Same tone, same pace, the voice that did not argue and did not threaten and did not need to do either. "You sent men to break an old man's fingers. You set up a dead man's loan to steal his widow's land." He looked at Briggs with the flat attention of 15 years of mountains, the attention that had seen winter kill and spring return, and storms that broke things, and seasons that rebuilt them. "You're done here. The only question is whether you ride down or whether you don't." Briggs's 4 men were looking at each other with the expressions of men running arithmetic. Tobias was on the high ground. Caleb was in front. Eleanor was on the porch, with a rifle and 3 weeks of practice, and the accuracy to prove it. The numbers were not in Briggs's favor, and every one of his hired men knew it. The man to Briggs's right turned his horse. That was all it took. One man making the practical decision. The man to his left followed. The 2 behind exchanged one look and turned as well. Briggs stood alone in front of the cabin on foot, with 4 of his men already walking their horses south. Eleanor watched his face in that moment. She had wondered in the nights leading up to this what she would feel when she finally saw Walter Briggs understand that it was over. She had expected satisfaction. She had expected the cold rage to release into something cleaner. What she actually felt was simpler and stranger than either of those things. She felt tired. The specific exhaustion of someone who has been holding something heavy for a very long time and has just set it down. Not dramatically, not with ceremony, just set it down because the moment arrived and it was time. "Your letters are with Agent Hargrove," she said to Briggs. Her voice was quiet, not triumphant, just clear. "The tax records are with Agent Hargrove. Mr. Kell's testimony is with Agent Hargrove. The deputy marshal will be in this county in 4 days. She looked at him. What you do with the next 4 days is your business. But what you've done with the last 3 years is now the federal government's business, and there's nothing you can do to change that. Briggs looked at her for a long moment. He was a man who had planned things carefully and executed them patiently, and had genuinely believed he had found an uncomplicated target. She could see him reassembling the version of events in which he was still the protagonist, still the aggrieved party, still the reasonable businessman, dealing with an unfortunate widow who had complicated a straightforward legal matter. She could see him trying to find the version where this was still recoverable. He couldn't find it. He got back on his horse. He did not say anything else. He turned and rode south after his men, and Eleanor watched him go, and she kept watching until the trail bent and the trees took him, and the sound of his horse faded into the ordinary sounds of the mountain in the morning. Then she exhaled. Tobias called down from the high ground. He's clear on the North Pass, heading toward the main trail. A pause. Should I follow? No, Caleb called back. Let him go. Tobias came down from the high ground with his splinted fingers and his rifle, and his expression of a man who had expected more drama and was mildly disappointed. He looked at Eleanor. You talked him down, he said. He talked himself down, she said. I just gave him the information. Same thing, Tobias said. In my experience, the best fights are the ones that don't happen. He squinted at the cabin. You got coffee in there? We have coffee, Eleanor said. And I'll hear no criticism of where it's stored. Tobias looked at Caleb, who looked at the tree line, and Tobias made a sound that was unmistakably a laugh and went inside. The deputy marshal arrived 3 days later, a day ahead of schedule. A young man named Cole, who had the organized manner of someone who had ridden hard to get there and was ready to work. Eleanor sat with him for 2 hours at the table and walked him through everything. The documents, the timeline, the tax records, Kell's letters, the approach of Briggs and his men, the names she had noted, and the date and the time. Cole wrote everything down in a small leather book, with the seriousness of a man who understood that what he was writing was going to matter in a federal courtroom. Caleb sat by the door the whole time. He said almost nothing. At the end, Cole asked him to confirm the events of the morning of the 14th. Caleb confirmed them in 12 words, which was exactly what was required, and nothing more. Cole accepted this without apparent surprise and wrote it down. Before Cole left, he looked at Eleanor with the slightly uncertain air of a young man who wanted to say something and wasn't sure if it was appropriate. Then he said it anyway. Mrs. Whitaker, in my experience, cases like this one, fraud on this scale, planned this carefully, they don't usually come to light. The people who could prove it usually don't have the documentation, or they don't know what they have, or they're not in a position to do anything with it, even if they do. He paused. This is the most complete evidentiary package I've seen brought to a federal investigation. Whoever organized this understood exactly what they were building. Eleanor said, I had help. Cole glanced at Caleb. Caleb looked at the wall. I meant the legal organization, Cole said. So did I, Eleanor said. Cole left. Tobias left the following morning, declining all offers of extended hospitality, with the cheerful independence of a man who had places to be, and a trapline that wasn't checking itself. He shook Eleanor's hand again on the way out, and said quietly so that Caleb, who was 20 feet away, couldn't hear, He's been different since you came up. I've known him a long time. He's different. He looked at her with the direct eyes of a man who had lived long enough to say what he meant. Good different. Eleanor said, I know. Tobias nodded once and walked away down the mountain. She stood in the cabin door and watched him go, and then turned back to the cabin. Her cabin, the one with the coffee on the right shelf, and the 2 chairs at the table, and the loft above, and the women's novels and the notes for a garden by the creek. And Caleb Thornton was standing at the table, looking at the map of the property with a pencil in his hand, and the expression of a man who was planning something. What are you mapping? She said. The south field, he said. It gets enough sun that it might work for grain. If you're planting a garden by the creek, we might as well consider what else we're growing. She came to the table, She looked at the map over his shoulder. She pointed at a section near the tree line. That section there. Is the soil any good? Better than the field. More sheltered. Herbs, she said. If the soil's decent. Rosemary does well at altitude if it's sheltered. He looked at the section she'd indicated. He made a note on the map. She watched his handwriting, careful and deliberate, the same quality as everything he did. She said, Caleb. Yes. Thank you. He looked up from the map. For the mercantile, she said. For let her go. For all of it. He looked at her for a moment. You didn't need me, he said. You had the claws. I had the claws, she agreed. I needed someone to buy me enough time to use it. Something shifted in his face, the thaw, and the warmth, and the specific expression she had been collecting for weeks, and was now fairly certain she would be collecting for the foreseeable future. He looked at her, and then he looked back at the map and said, The circuit judge comes through Red Hollow in 10 days. I know, she said. We'll need to ride down. I know. It'll be cold by then. You'll need better trail gear than you came up with. I have better gear now. Yes, he said. You do. He made another note on the map. I want to add a second room to the cabin before winter. The storage room is too cold for what it's being used for. He did not look up. There are things I've been keeping in the storage room that would do better in a warmer space. She understood that he was not talking about storage. What kinds of things, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Books, he said finally. Among other things. Eleanor smiled. She looked at the map of their land, south field and creek bank, and the herb section near the tree line. And she thought about Margaret's novels on the shelf, and 2 chairs at a table, and the particular quality of a silence that carried more in it than most conversations. She thought about Thomas, who had hoped constantly, and against evidence, and she thought that wherever Thomas was, he was probably hoping for her still, and that the hope had arrived, not the way either of them would have predicted, not on easy roads or through gentle circumstances, but in the specific way that real things tended to arrive through difficulty and documentation, and a man who said, let her go, and meant every word. She thought about Clause 7, which she had memorized like a prayer, and about how the prayer had worked, not by itself, not cleanly, not without cost, but it had worked. She put her hand on the table beside the map. Caleb put his hand over hers. They stood like that for a moment in the cabin that had been grief for 15 years, and was becoming slowly and practically and without ceremony something else entirely. Outside the Rockies held the morning in their old and patient way, and the smoke rose from the chimney in a clean line, and the horses moved in the lean-to, and the south field waited in the thin October sun, and the creek ran cold and clear past the place where the garden was going to be. In Red Hollow, Walter Briggs was preparing to face a federal investigation with no attorney, no documentation, and no uncomplicated targets left. In Gentry, Arthur Kell was cooperating fully with Agent Hargrove, who was building the kind of case that didn't get overturned on appeal. In the mountains, Tobias Hale was on his trap line with his healing fingers and his rifle, and the satisfied expression of a man who had been on the right side of something. And in a cabin on a Colorado mountain in the autumn of 1884, a woman who had ridden up from nothing with a legal clause and a leather folder, and the absolute refusal to be what anyone else decided she was, stood beside the man she was going to marry, and looked at a map of the land they were going to keep, and understood, with the complete clarity that had always been her particular gift, that the life in front of her was not the one she had planned. It was better. Not easier. Not without storms. Not without the ongoing argument about the coffee shelf, which was going to run for years, and which neither of them was going to win decisively, because that was not the point of it. Not without the grief that lived alongside the new things, because grief did not leave it, only learned to share the space with what came after it. But better. Because Eleanor Whitaker had never needed to be saved. She had needed someone willing to stand next to her while she saved herself. And on a summer morning in Red Hollow, Colorado, a mountain man who came down for flour and salt and ammunition had walked into a general store and put his hand on his revolver and said 3 words, and those 3 words had been the beginning of everything. He never threatened, he acted, and that had made all the difference.